Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, allow me to reiterate to you Cuba's support for your work at the helm of the United Nations as a guarantor and advocate of international peace. Heads of state and government, distinguished delegates, I would like to express my deep condolences to the relatives of those victims of Hurricanes Irma and Maria, as well as our readiness to increase our cooperation to the extent of our modest possibilities with our brother peoples and governments of Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, small Caribbean islands which have suffered terrible devastation, with the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Saint Martin, Saint Martin, Virgin Islands, and Anguilla. I call upon the international community to give the highest priority to this situation and mobilize resources to assist small Caribbean island states and territories which have suffered such devastation. We would like to convey Cuba's warmest feelings of solidarity to the government and people of Mexico, particularly to the victims and their relatives who were affected by both earthquakes, and we reiterate to them our readiness to assist their people and support the recovery works with our modest efforts. We also want to express our sorrow to the people of the United States, as well as our heartfelt condolences to the relatives of those who have died and all victims of Hurricane Irma. Mr. President, I have come to speak on behalf of the Cuban people who are currently carrying out enormous efforts to recover from the severe damages to houses, agriculture, the power system, and other services caused by Hurricane Irma. Despite comprehensive preventive measures, including the evacuation of more than 1.7 million people and the full cooperation of all citizens, we suffered the loss of 10 people. The severe damages to services, as well as the loss of social and personal goods, and the hardships endured by families that spent many hours without electricity or water, contributed to strengthening the unity and the solidarity of our noble and heroic people. The moving scenes of rescuers saving a girl and giving her back to her mother, of a little boy picking up a bust of José Martí from the rubble, of students helping families they had not met before, of soldiers from the armed forces and the Ministry of the Interior doing the toughest jobs, of local leaders heading the most difficult tasks have all become too familiar. During a visit paid to the area that suffered the most severe devastation, President Raúl Castro issued an appeal which read, and I quote, "These have been tough days for our people who, in only a few hours, have seen how what was built with great effort has been destroyed by a devastating hurricane. The images received during the last few hours are too eloquent, just as much as the spirit of resilience and victory of our people that are reborn in the face of every adversity." On behalf of the government and people of Cuba, I sincerely appreciate the genuine expressions of solidarity and affection expressed by numerous governments, parliaments, international organizations, and representatives of civil society. I wish to convey my profound gratitude for the numerous offers of assistance we have received. Mr. President, I still keep vivid and fond memories of the imposing presence of Fidel Castro Ruz, the commander-in-chief of the Cuban Revolution, and the great validity of the ideas he expressed in this very assembly. On behalf of our people and government, I would like to express our gratitude for the feelings of respect, affection, and admiration we have received from everyone. Mr. President, on Tuesday, President Donald Trump came here to convince us that one of his purposes is to promote the prosperity of nations and persons. But in the real world, the wealth owned by 8 men together is equivalent to the wealth shared by 3.6 billion human beings who make up the poorest half of humanity. 69 of the 100 largest entities of the world are transnationals, not states. The wealth of the world's 10 largest corporations is higher than the public revenues earned by 180 countries combined. 700 million persons live in extreme poverty. 21 million are victims of forced labor. In 2015, 5.9 million children died of preventable or curable diseases before the age of 5. 758 million adults are illiterate. 815 million people suffer from chronic hunger, tens of millions more than in 2015. 2 billion are undernourished. Even if the precarious decreasing growth rate of recent years rebounds, 653 million people will continue to face hunger by the year 2030, and this will not be enough to eradicate hunger by the year 2050. There are 22.5 million refugees. Humanitarian tragedies associated with migrant flows worsen and increase amidst a clearly unjust international economic and political order. The building of walls and barriers, as well as laws and measures adopted to prevent waves of refugees and migrants, have proved to be cruel and ineffective. There is a proliferation of exclusive and xenophobic policies that violate the human rights of millions of people and fail to resolve the problems of underdevelopment, poverty, and armed conflicts, which are the main causes of migration and refugee claims. Military expenditures have increased to $1.7 trillion. This reality contradicts those who claim that there are not enough resources to eradicate poverty. However, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development lacks the means for its implementation due to the egoism and lack of political will of the United States and other industrialized countries. What is this miraculous recipe that President Donald Trump recommends to us in the absence of the financial flows of the Marshall Plan? Who will contribute resources for that purpose? And how can this be reconciled with the idea advanced by Presidents Reagan years ago and Trump now, the idea of America first? President Trump ignores and distorts history and portrays a pipe dream as a goal to be pursued. The very production and consumption patterns of neoliberal capitalism are unsustainable and irrational and will inexorably lead to the destruction of the environment and to the end of the human species. Can anyone forget the consequences of colonialism, slavery, neocolonialism, and imperialism? Could the several decades of bloody military dictatorships in Latin America be referred to as an example of successful capitalism? Does anyone know of any recipe of neoliberal capitalism that has been better applied than those which destroyed the Latin American economies in the 1980s? It is urgent and indispensable for the United Nations to work to establish a new participatory, democratic, equitable, and inclusive international economic order, and a new financial architecture that takes into account the needs and the specificities of developing countries and the asymmetries that exist in world trade and finances as a result of centuries of exploitation and plundering. Industrialized countries have the moral duty, the historic responsibility, as well as sufficient financial and technological means to establish that order. Not even the rich will enjoy prosperity if climate change is not stopped. Cuba regrets the decision taken by the U.S. government, which historically has been the main greenhouse gas emitting government in the planet, to withdraw its country from the Paris Agreement. In 2016, and for the third year in a row, the records of average global temperature increases have been broken. This confirms the fact that climate change is a threat to the survival of humanity and to the sustainable development of our peoples. We reiterate our solidarity with small island developing states, particularly in the Caribbean and the Pacific, which are the most affected by climate change, and for whom we claim just, special, and differentiated treatment. We also support priority attention given to the needs of sub-Saharan Africa. Mr. President, the U.S. government has come here to tell us that in addition to prosperity, the other two beautiful pillars of international order are sovereignty and security. We all share the common responsibility of preserving the existence of human beings in the face of a nuclear threat. A major contribution to the achievement of that goal was the historic adoption and signing under the auspices of this Assembly of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which bans the use and threat of use of those weapons that have the capacity to annihilate the human species. The United States has strongly opposed this treaty. It announced that it will invest $700 billion in military expenditures, and it is developing an extremely aggressive nuclear and military doctrine based on the threat to use force and the use of force. NATO member states have violated international peace and security and international law by promoting military intervention and non-conventional wars against sovereign states. As was pointed out by the Commander-in-Chief of the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro Ruz, and I quote, "Let the philosophy of plunder disappear, and the philosophy of war will also disappear." The illegal imposition of unilateral coercive measures and the use of financial, legal, cultural, and communication instruments to destabilize governments, as well as the denial of people's right to self-determination, have become commonplace. The covert use of information and communication technologies to attack other states has increased, while several developed countries strongly oppose the adoption of international treaties that would regulate cooperation in order to secure a safe cyberspace. The U.S. President manipulates the concepts of sovereignty and security to his exclusive benefit and to the detriment of all others, including his allies. The attempt to resort to military threat and force to stop the irreversible world trend to multipolarization and polycentrism will seriously jeopardize international peace and security, which should be defended and preserved through international efforts. The principles of sovereign equality, respect for the territorial integrity, and non-interference in the internal affairs of states should be observed. The UN Charter and international law do not allow for a reinterpretation. UN reform should pursue the principal goal of responding to the pressing needs of people and the great disadvantaged majority. Multilateralism should be protected and reinforced in the face of imperialist interests of domination and hegemony. Democratization of the Security Council, both in terms of its composition and its working methods, is a most urgent task. It is essential to strengthen the General Assembly and recover the functions that have been usurped. Mr. President, patriotism, which was invoked in the U.S. statement, is a perversion of humanism, of love and loyalty to homeland, and the enrichment and defense of national and universal culture. It embodies an exceptionalist and supremacist vision of ignorant intolerance in the face of diverse political, economic, social, and cultural models. In developed countries, the loss of legitimacy of political systems and parties has worsened, and electoral abstentionism is on the rise. Corruption, legal and illegal, is spreading. There is the extreme case of the so-called special interests or corporate payments in exchange for benefits in the country that spends the highest amount of money in electoral campaigns, and where, paradoxically, a candidate with the lowest number of popular votes can be elected or entitled to govern with the negligible support of voters. There has been an increasing and unheard of use of science and technology to exercise hegemony, mutilate national cultures, and manipulate human behavior, as is the case of the so-called big data or psychometry used for political and advertising purposes. 7 consortia keep a strict control over whatever is read, watched, or heard in the planet. Technologies are being monopolized. The governance of digital networks is dictatorial and discriminatory, and despite appearances, the digital divide between rich and poor countries is increasing. Opportunities and the rights of youth, migrants, and workers are curtailed, and their human rights are openly and systematically violated. The day before yesterday, the U.S. Vice President Michael Pence, ridiculously ignoring the functions of the Security Council and attempting to establish new prerogatives, said that this body, the Security Council, should modify the composition and methods of the UN Human Rights Council, which, as he said, doesn't deserve its name because a clear majority of the Human Rights Council members fail to meet even the most basic human rights standards, end of quote. I assume that Mr. Pence is not including in this case his own country, which will in fact deserve to be included because of its pattern of systematic violations of human rights, namely the use of torture, arbitrary detentions, and imprisonment, as occurs in the Guantanamo naval base, the assassination of African Americans by law enforcement agents, the killing of innocent civilians by its troops, and xenophobia and repression against immigrants, including minors, as well as its very limited compliance with international instruments. Mr. President, we reaffirm our strongest condemnation against all forms and manifestations of terrorism, and we reject double standards in combating them. The urgent search for a just and lasting solution to the conflict in the Middle East is based on the exercise of the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and the existence of a free and independent state within the pre-1967 borders with Eastern Jerusalem as its capital. The situation in Western Sahara requires an effort in accordance with UN resolutions to guarantee the Saharan people's exercise to self-determination and to ensure respect for their legitimate right to live in peace in their own territory. Cuba reaffirms its support for the search for a peaceful and negotiated solution to the war in Syria without any foreign interference and with full respect for its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Threats to international peace and security resulting from the expansion of NATO's presence along the Russian borders are on the rise. We continue to reject unilateral and unjust sanctions imposed against that country. We demand respect for the so-called nuclear agreement signed with the Islamic Republic of Iran. We reject the threat to totally destroy the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, home to 25 million human beings. War is not an option in the Korean Peninsula. It would threaten the existence of hundreds of millions of people in this area and in neighboring countries, and it would lead to a nuclear war of unpredictable consequences. Only through dialogue and negotiation will it be possible to achieve a lasting political solution that should take into account the legitimate concerns of all parties involved. We support the total denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula without any foreign interference, with absolute respect for sovereign equality and territorial integrity of states, and strictly abiding by the principle of not using or threatening to use force. Mr. President, new threats today are hovering over peace and stability in Latin America and the Caribbean, in open disrespect for the proclamation of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace, signed in Havana by heads of state and government in our region in January 2014 during the second summit of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC. We reiterate what was expressed by President Raúl Castro Ruz regarding the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela on July 14th, and I quote, "The aggression and putschist violence against Venezuela harms all of our America and only serves the interests of those set on dividing us to exercise their control over our people, unconcerned about causing conflicts of incalculable consequence in this region, like those we are seeing in different parts of the world." Today, he continued, "Today we warn that those attempting to overthrow the Bolivarian and Chavista revolution through unconstitutional, violent, and putschist methods will shoulder a serious responsibility in the eyes of history." End of quote. We strongly reject the military threats against Venezuela. The executive order that designates it as a threat to the national security of the United States and the unilateral, unjust, and arbitrary sanctions applied against it. We reiterate our unwavering solidarity with the Bolivarian and Chavista government and people and its civic military union led by the constitutional president, Nicolás Maduro Moros. We denounce and condemn the NICA Act initiative promoted in the U.S. Congress as part of an interventionist behavior which is intended to impose an economic embargo against the people and government of Nicaragua, to whom we reiterate our support. We express our solidarity with former President Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, victim of a political persecution intended to prevent him from running for direct elections by means of a judicial disqualification. Lula, President Dilma Rousseff, the Workers' Party, and the Brazilian people will always find Cuba on their side. We reiterate our historic commitment with the free determination and independence of the Puerto Rican people. We support the legitimate claim of Argentina for sovereignty over the Malvinas, South Georgias, and South Sandwich Islands. Cuba will continue to contribute to the extent possible and at the request of the parties involved its efforts to achieve stable and lasting peace in Colombia. We will uphold our commitment to share our modest achievements with the peoples of the South, including the efforts of the 41,000 cooperation workers deployed in 63 countries to struggle for the life and health of human beings. Mr. President, on June 16th, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, announced the new Cuba policy of his administration, which is a setback in U.S.-Cuba bilateral relations and undermines the basis established 2 years ago to move towards a new type of relationship between our two countries, characterized by respect and equality. The U.S. government has decided to tighten the economic, commercial, and financial embargo by imposing new obstacles to the already limited possibilities its business community had to trade with and invest in Cuba, as well as additional restrictions on U.S. citizens wishing to travel to our country. Those decisions ignore the support from broad sectors in the United States, including the majority of Cuban émigrés, to the lifting of the blockade and the normalization of relations. They only serve the interests of a group of Cubans, of individuals of Cuban origin based in South Florida, which is an ever more isolated and minority group that insists on harming Cuba and its people for having decided to defend at all costs the right to be free, independent, and sovereign. Today, we reiterate our condemnation of the measures aimed at tightening the blockade, and we reaffirm that any strategy intended to destroy the Cuban Revolution will fail. Likewise, we reject the manipulation of the human rights issue against Cuba, which has much to be proud of and has no need to receive lessons from the United States or from anyone. We wish to express our strongest condemnation of the disrespectful, offensive, and interventionist statement against Cuba and the Cuban government made 3 days ago from this rostrum by President Donald Trump. We remind him that the United States, where flagrant human rights violations are committed, which raise serious concern in the international community, has no moral authority whatsoever to judge my country. We reaffirm that Cuba will never accept any preconditions or impositions, nor will it ever renounce any of its principles. Regarding the alleged incidents that would have affected U.S. diplomatic officials in Havana, we categorically affirm that the Cuban government rigorously and seriously abides by its obligations under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations to ensure the protection and integrity of all diplomats without exception, including those from the United States. Cuba has never perpetrated, nor will it ever perpetrate actions of this sort, nor has Cuba allowed or will it ever allow its territory to be used by third parties for that purpose. The Cuban authorities, based on the preliminary results of the priority investigation that is being carried out with a high technical component, following instructions from the top level of our government, has taken into account data contributed by the U.S. authorities, has to date not found any evidence whatsoever that could confirm the cause or the origin of the health disorders referred to by U.S. diplomats and their relatives. The investigation to clarify this matter is ongoing, and in order to arrive at a conclusion, it will be crucial to have the effective cooperation of the U.S. authorities. It would be unfortunate if a matter of this nature were to be politicized. As was expressed by the Cuban President Raúl Castro Ruz, Cuba is willing to continue negotiating on all pending bilateral issues with the United States on the basis of equality and absolute respect for the sovereignty and independence of our country, and will maintain a respectful dialogue and cooperation in areas of common interest with the U.S. government. Cuba and the United States can cooperate and coexist, respecting our differences and promoting everything which benefits both countries and peoples. But no one should expect Cuba to make concessions that will affect its sovereignty and independence. Mr. President, the Cuban people will not cease in their legitimate claim for the lifting and total elimination of the economic, commercial, and financial blockade, and will continue to denounce the strengthening of that policy. On November 1st, Cuba once again will present to the United Nations General Assembly the draft resolution entitled "The Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Blockade Imposed by the Government of the United States of America against Cuba." While inequality, the opulence of a few, and the marginalization of many are growing in today's world, the Cuban people will pursue their struggle to achieve the most just society possible. We will continue to advance steadily down the path of revolutionary transformation that has been sovereignly chosen by all Cubans to further improve our socialism. Thank you.